Okay, kids, we're back. We're going to continue to read Peak by Roland Smith. We're going to be starting in chapter 4 today. Just a little recap so you remember. Peak was climbing the skyscraper, got busted while he was on the building by the police and everything else. Ends up going to the juvenile detention center, which is police for younger kids younger than 18. And then something really bad happens. Another kid is trying to climb a skyscraper to be like him and ends up falling off and dying. So where we ended up was Peak thinking that he might end up spending 3 years in jail before, or in the juvenile detention center, and he's really worried about that. Okay, in chapters 4 and 5, I'll let you look at what your writing assignment here is. Hopefully you can read that. It says, in chapters 4 and 5, there is a major turn of events. Explain in 1 to 2 paragraphs what you can infer about the judge saying poof. The judge is going to say that. Poof. How does this play into his decision, talking about the judge? So this is going to be a big part of the book, and you'll see it right at the end of chapter 4. The judge says poof. And you got to kind of, I usually end up explaining this to my 6th grade classes, but I want you guys to write about it and see if you can infer how this situation really went and what the judge is really saying. All right, chapter 4. It's called Circling the Drain. I could tie a Bachman, a bowline, a butterfly, a figure eight, a double fisherman, and half a dozen other knots with one hand in the dark. But I couldn't get the tie knotted properly around my neck. The few times I'd worn one, Rolf had done the honors. The guard assigned to escort me to the courtroom finally came to my rescue. Between us, we figured it out. Then he led me to the courtroom. Sitting at the table to the left of the bench were the prosecuting attorneys, a man and a woman, shuffling through papers, barely looking up at the person whose life they were about to ruin. At the table to the right were my attorneys, another man and a woman. They too were shuffling papers, but they stopped when the guard passed me off to them, smiling, shaking my hand, and introducing themselves. I didn't quite catch their names. I was too busy staring at the 5 people sitting behind them. Rolf, looking dapper and professional with his perfectly knotted tie. Next to him were Patrice and Paula. They were a little teary-eyed but excited to see me, wearing their favorite dresses, matching, of course. They waved and tried to stifle the giggles when I mouthed pee-pee at them. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't in a joking mood at the moment, but I felt the twins could use a little bit of a boost. They had been through enough the past few days. Next to the twins was my mom, looking worried but distinctly more relaxed than she had been at JDC the day before. Maybe this was because of the guy sitting next to her, although I doubted it. His name was Joshua Wood, arguably the greatest mountaineer in the world, and he was also my father. I hadn't seen him in 7 years, and he looked about as comfortable in his suit as I felt in mine. He had shaved his trademark beard, recently by the looks of it. The skin beneath was pale compared to the upper part of his handsome face, which was windburned and sunburned. His lips were chapped and his nose was peeling, giving him the overall look of someone who had just dug out from under an avalanche. His eyes were the same pale blue as my mother's, and he gave me a nod and a smile, which I was too stunned to return. All rise, the bailiff said, startling me out of my stupor. One of the attorneys turned me around and gave me a dazzling smile. I expected her to say, love the tie, but what she said instead was, don't say one word unless I tell you, and act remorseful. She was obviously my lead attorney. I thought her name was Tracy. The judge, a tough-looking guy with a white crew cut, took his seat behind the bench, and he made a stand for a few seconds before nodding at the bailiff. Be seated, the bailiff said with a slight quiver in his voice. My mom was right. The judge was going to eat me up and spit me out. He put on a pair of glasses and went over some notes. Then he started reading the charges aloud. Criminal trespass, vandalism, reckless endangerment. It went on and on. Finally, reaching the end of the list, he pushed his glasses to the end of his nose and he looked over the top of them directly at me. How do you plead? Tracy pulled me to my feet and whispered the answer in my ear. I wasn't sure that I'd heard her right. She whispered it again with the same smile plastered on her face from before. I took a deep breath. Not guilty, I said. To all charges? The judge asked incredulously. That's right, Your Honor, Tracy answered, her smile unwavering. You've got to be kidding me. The state has videotape of him climbing the Woolworth building. There were 23 cops on the roof that saw him being pulled over the railing. He signed a statement attesting to the facts. That was duress, Tracy said. He was exhausted, injured, and half frozen at the time. Oh, please. This kid has received absolutely every consideration the system can offer, including delaying this arraignment. Now, what's this all about? We want to go to trial, Tracy answered. Oh, the arteries in the judge's neck looked like they were about to burst. He glared over at the prosecutor's table. Do you know anything about this? The prosecutors just shook their head vigorously. Perhaps we should retire to your chambers, one of them suggested. Yes, Tracy agreed cheerfully. The four of you crammed into my office? The judge said. Forget it. There's no one here but... He noticed Patrice and Paula sitting between my mom and Rolf. Oh, he said. Then he looked over at the guard who had brought me down the elevator. Do you think you can take these young ladies out and find them some ice cream? What about the prisoner? The guard asked. I think he'll hang around for this. He looked at the twins. Do you like ice cream? Chocolate, Paula said. Vanilla, Patrice said. I think that can be arranged. Do you want us to bring you back some, Peek? Paula asked. I bet they have strawberry, Patrice said. My favorite. But it sounded like awberry because she had recently lost her front teeth. Nah, I said. I had a big bowl for breakfast. You did not, they said in unison, giggling as the guard took them out. The judge waited for the door to swing completely closed before continuing the proceedings. He nodded at the court reporter. We're off the record. She turned off her recorder and she stopped typing. It's just us now, the judge continued, looking at Tracy. You know as well as I do that we don't want to go to trial with this. It's turned into a media circus. A boy was killed 2 days ago, and I'm sure you and Peek and his parents don't want that to happen again. Of course not, Tracy said. But by the same token, I can't let my client be unfairly incarcerated because the media is out of control. This whole thing has not been handled well by the police department or the mayor's office. The judge looked at her for a moment, then he looked over at the prosecutors. She makes a good point. What do you think? The older of the two prosecutors, the woman, stood. Prior to the arraignment, we offered a plea bargain of 2 years with 6 months off for good behavior. 18 months is a pretty good deal considering the charges. Not if you're serving it, I thought, but it was better than 3 years. Tracy picked up a sheet of paper from the table. In the last 5 years, 15 adults have been arrested for climbing skyscrapers in New York City. The longest sentence has been 6 months, and several of these climbers served no time at all. She looked at the prosecutor. We can beat this in court. We're going to trial. The prosecutor gave her a sour look. I felt the drain being plugged, but it wasn't watertight yet. What's your bottom line? The judge asked. A fine with probation, Tracy answered, and no time served. Forget it, the judge said gruffly. What if we could arrange for Peek to leave New York today? Tracy asked. Out of sight, out of mind, out of newspaper, no interviews. The story dies because the story is gone. Poof. The judge almost smiled. A disappearing act, huh? Explain. Peek's biological father has offered to take custody of him. I whipped around so fast that I hurt my neck. My father had gotten to his feet. I take it you're the father? Yes, sir. Joshua Wood. The climber? Yes, sir. The judge glanced at Rolf and Mom, then looked back at Joshua. Mr. Wood, how much time have you spent with your son lately? Not much the past few years, he admitted. Not any for the last 7 years, to be exact, I thought. When Terry and Rolf got married, he continued, we decided it would be best for Peek if I kept a low profile. This was the first time I've heard of this. In fact, I wasn't sure my father knew that Rolf and my mother had even got married until he stepped into the courtroom. Maybe she had sent him a postcard or something. He certainly hadn't been invited to the wedding. Why do you want to do this? The judge asked. Peak is my son. It's time I stepped forward and took some responsibility. I looked at my mother and Rolf. They were both staring straight ahead, expressionless. What do you think? The judge asked. Tracy elbowed me in the side and I turned back around. Me? The judge nodded. That would be great, Your Honor. The judge turned his attention back to my father. Do you have the wherewithal to support and raise a 14-year-old boy? We've prepared a complete financial statement, Tracy said. She grabbed a sheaf of papers from the desk and took it up to the bench. The judge flipped through the papers. As you can see, Mr. Wood is a very successful businessman. On paper, the judge said begrudgingly. He looked at my father again. Where do you live, Mr. Wood? Chiang Mai, my father answered. What state's that in? It's in Thailand. This was followed by a very long silence, and I felt the drug plane loosen. What about Peak's schooling? The judge finally asked. There's an international school less than 5 miles from my house, the father answered. I've already enrolled him. He'll begin in August. Peak is currently attending the Green Street School, Tracy said. He only has one requirement left to complete this year. It should be easily accomplished in Thailand. The Green Street School, the judge smiled for the first time. It just so happens that I went to GSS when I was a kid. I didn't know they had legal prodigies. The judge waved the prosecutor up to the bench where they had a long whispered conversation. Then it was over. He looked at all of us one by one. All right, he said. This is what we're going to do, Peak. You are on probation until you reach the age of 18. If during that time you break the law in the state of New York, thus violating your probation, you will immediately serve out the rest of your time in juvenile detention facility. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Furthermore, the court fines you $150,000. My shock must have shown because the judge put up his hand for me to calm down. The money will be held in escrow by the state and returned to you if you fulfill the terms of your probation. He looked over at my parents. I assume you can scrape the money together? No problem, Your Honor, my father said. Mom and Rolf concurred. If I'm going to cut Peak loose, we have to make this look good, the judge continued. I'm putting a gag order on all of you. You are not to discuss any aspect of this case with the media or anyone else, especially the refundable fine. We want to discourage people from copying Peak's idiotic stunt. In other words, we want this to go away. He looked at Tracy and at me. Poof, he said. And that's the end of chapter 4. So one more time, think about the judge and his lawyer saying, poof. Okay, how does that play into this big turn of events? And you'll be getting chapter 5 soon.